Chapter 1, Worst Case Scenario. Silas shrugged off his lab coat, smoothing his black button-up shirt with a hand and hanging up the long white coat with another. Even after a long day in the lab, working with various toxins, he didn't seem affected in the slightest. His steely green eyes carried the same emotionless stare behind his black-framed glasses, and his toned, though slight, build still stood ramrod straight. As he left the university, he was greeted by passing students and professors. He gave them each a polite but curt nod, his strides long and almost vigorous. The fall air was a bit brisk, but refreshing to his nose. The university had quite an open concept design, and after walking down from the top floor labs, the first floor was nothing but large, arching pillars that held up the higher floors and let the rush of wind and nature in. It's getting dark, a bit early for that, he thought. Winter was coming, and daylight saving time had already passed, but it was still around only 4 o'clock. The sun probably shouldn't have begun to set until 5. Silas found it a bit curious. It's all the global warming, I tell ya. It's already the first week of December, but have you seen a lick of snow? I'm telling you, those browns, they're SC. Silas' long strides didn't slow as he passed by a hot dog cart. He caught some of the conversation, but he wasn't going to slow down to intrude. Plus, what could global warming have to do with when night and day came? Ellipsis. It's possible, Silas thought. If there's enough of a change at the North and South poles, the tilt of Earth could shift enough that daylight would. A string of thoughts came to Silas' mind, followed by an even longer string of equations and calculations. He didn't bother to stop these thoughts, it was a nice way to pass the time as he moved. The world was an interesting place. He doubted the hot dog merchant knew of all of this, and most might scoff at his claims, but there had been the possibility of a kernel of truth to it. Silas still didn't believe that it would happen. Half the world thought that global warming would be the end of all things. The other half thought it was an overblown mess conjured up by fear-mongers. To Silas, as were most things, he felt the truth was in the middle somewhere, though potentially leaning more to one side than the other. He ended up spending quite some time on this problem, and before he knew it, his home was before him. To have a house so close to the university, Silas, or rather his family, was quite well off. The suburban home came with a 3-car garage, a well-trimmed lawn, and the ample spacing between homes one would expect from a gated community full of those of upper-class society. Silas opened the unlocked door and bent down to pull his dress shoes off. However, he was unexpectedly barraged with noise much more substantial than he would expect from his home. The commotion was muffled, so he couldn't quite make out the exact words being said, but there was definitely an argument going on. His indifference gave way to a frown. He lived with his mother, father, grandfather, and little sister. It could be considered to be a harmonious household, and he had been quite lucky all his life. The most his parents would argue about is what to have for dinner. The sound of footsteps caught Silas' attention and an elegant, middle-aged woman came into view from the living room. A little girl of about 13 years old clung to her, tears brimming in her large green eyes. The middle-aged woman wore quite a helpless expression. Silas, you're home, that's good. You know I've told you to just take one of the cars. Why do you insist on walking every day? These were words Silas had heard many times before, but he could tell that his mother just wanted to take her mind off of the argument happening in the basement. Silas had deduced that, for it to be so muffled, it could only be taking place down there. The basement could be considered the man cave of the house. It was there the gym and various games were located. This wasn't to say that these things were important now, but rather that it was a place Silas' father and grandfather tended to go to relax. It was odd that an argument would break out between them down there. Unless someone else was involved. Silas doubted it. His parents were business professionals, but they had a strict, no work from home, policy. So, it couldn't be a colleague, but he couldn't think of any friends his parents would have that could trigger such a big argument, either. It's not far, Mother. He walked forward, rubbing his sister's little head in an attempt to comfort her. It's at least 5 kilometers. Just look, the skies are already dark, but your last lessons ended at 4. You know it's not safe out these days. Silas listened to his mother's nagging without complaint. If he cared so much about escaping his family, as a 26-year-old who had already secured tenure at his university, he could have moved out long ago. Life on the outside didn't have much attraction to him. He had quite a few friends, though no best friends. He had had girlfriends in the past, but most were infatuated by an ideal of who he was, instead of the person he actually was. He wasn't a fan of drinking, partying, or smoking. All the reasons he might be eager to escape his mother's hawk-like eyes simply didn't exist. "I'll go see what's going on," Silas finally managed to fit in a word. His mother hesitated, but ultimately nodded. She didn't want to get in between her husband and her father-in-law. It really was best if Silas went. Silas nodded and headed down the hall, opening the door to the basement and making his way down. The fury he was expecting didn't hit him. Instead, there were waves of exasperation. The less you heard of it, the worse it sounded. But it seemed that his father and grandfather didn't really need any mediation. "Cedric, I'm your father. When have I ever led you astray? Returning is the best option we have right now." "Dad, none of this makes any sense. You want us to pack up and suddenly go across the world. It's too ridiculous. Silas just started his tenure, and Alara is just finishing up her last year of middle school. How can we do that to them? The matters of the secular world aren't going to matter anymore in just a few months, Cedric. Don't you get it?" No, I don't get it. You've been telling me this nonsense ever since I was a kid and I never believed it." Silas walked in to find the two facing off against one another, each one standing on either side of the pool table. His father's face was practically red, and his grandfather was pinching his brows. "You've never wanted to listen to me. If your mother..." The two noticed Silas at that point. Silas felt that he had quite good timing, because he had a feeling his grandfather was about to say something that took the exasperation past the point toward rage. His grandmother had died long ago, before Silas had even been born. But according to what he knew, she had raised Cedric on her own until he was around 10 years old. After she died, Magnus returned and completed his fatherly duties. Silas didn't know much more about this situation, as it wasn't really his place to ask. What child knew every detail of their parents' past? He also didn't like the idea of digging up his father's trauma. Even so, he knew enough to know that his grandfather bringing up his grandmother would be an easy one-way ticket to ruin. It was a Friday, and he didn't want his weekend to be ruined by this. "Silas," Cedric spoke, a hint embarrassed. Honestly, the moment Magnus mentioned his mother, he had already seen red. It wasn't just him, but even Magnus looked to sigh a breath of relief. "What's going on?" Silas asked. "It's just..." Magnus and Cedric looked at one another. "You're already 26 years old, Silas. There are some things you should know," Cedric finally said. Looking at his son's lackluster reaction to these words, Cedric chuckled. He was about to reveal some big news, but Silas was already in analysis mode. "Forget it, it's not a big deal. We can be considered family with the Browns." Silas raised an eyebrow. The Brown family was synonymous with elite. They were currently the richest family in the world, had raised 3 billionaires in this generation alone, and could probably collapse the GDP of a medium-sized country on a Tuesday if they felt their coffee was a bit too cold that morning. That hot dog merchant had tried to blame global warming on them, and Silas didn't really blame him. The largest industry the Brown family had gotten its start in was the paper milling industry. Though they had grown since then, they still had quite a large piece of that pie and had deforested their fair share of lush forests. That said, Silas' reaction was basically as Magnus and Cedric had expected. "So what?" Magnus sighed. "I will tell you what I've been telling your father all of these years. He does not believe me, but what else can I do in my old age?" Cedric crossed his arms. If this old man couldn't convince him, how was he going to convince his logic-brained son? Magnus seemed to realize this as well, but he simply gritted his teeth and continued. "The most powerful families in the world aren't just there for show. There will always be things they know that the common people will not. Do you agree with this, Silas?" "I do." Silas nodded seriously. It was naive to believe otherwise. He didn't believe in conspiratorial theorists, nor did he believe government loyalists. Much like most things, he believed the answer was in the middle somewhere. "Good," Magnus nodded, feeling a bit hopeful. "I will get right to the point. The world will enter a state of complete upheaval soon. Our best chance to survive is to return to the Brown family estate." What sort of upheaval? War? Silas asked. Yes, Magnus said quickly, causing Cedric to roll his eyes. He's trying to whitewash it. The old man believes that a cataclysmic, apocalyptic-level event is coming. War might be just one of the many outcomes. Silas fell into silence. His grandfather had exhibited no signs of dementia. In fact, even now, he looked quite healthy. Magnus had ruddy bronzed skin, a bright head and beard of white, and he carried the same ramrod posture all men of their family had. Despite being in his early 70s, he had run a half marathon just 2 months ago. Dementia obviously didn't have outward signs, but Silas hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary, and he interacted with his grandfather every day. That aside, his grandfather had never spoken of such ridiculous things before. It made him more inclined to believe him. Isn't there a simple way to check? Silas said after a moment. Cedric's triumphant smile became bitter, and Magnus' eyes lit up. Silas walked to the side and unplugged a laptop that was streaming a movie to the flat screen. It was stuck on a cartoon princess, so Silas assumed that his sister had been down here before the argument broke out. He walked back and placed the laptop down on the pool table in view of his father and grandfather. The most elite families in the world, I can think of quite a few, but just to check, we only really need to focus on 3. Let's go with the Browns, the Abadi family, and the Rouse family. All 3 of these families have high-profile members that have their flight histories tracked, and all 3 have publicly known estate addresses. Silas looked up at his grandfather. Is the address of the Browns the same as the publicly available one? He spun the laptop screen toward his grandfather. It displayed a location deep in the Appalachians. Yes, this is the location, Magnus nodded. Good. That means we can reasonably conclude that if there's an upswell of returnees, then many of these high-profile people will be returning home as well. Lucius Brown, Malachi Brown, Astrid Brown. These 3 were just the 3 billionaires that the Brown family had created in this generation. All of them were in their 40s and had forged a path in their own unique industries. Silas frowned. Cedric frowned. Magnus laughed. Silas opened up a new tab. Cale Abadi, Asher Abadi. Silas' frown deepened. Ragnar Rouse, Thorn Rouse, Draven Rouse. Each one, again and again, without fail, all had flight histories tracking them right to their estates and none afterward. All within the last week. Silas' fingers sprang across the keyboard as though he were playing the keys of a piano. They seemed to blur as he moved faster. He forgot his grandfather and father were even present as he opened up tab after tab. He said that he would stop at 3 families, but he didn't. He pored over every powerful family he could think of, an entire dozen of them before he was satisfied. He even checked some of the more minor ones he didn't think were that special compared to the rest, and it hadn't changed a thing. Silas almost slammed the laptop shut. I do not know how true grandfather's words are, but we need to go. Worst case scenario, we return on Monday. Cedric's expression was solemn. He looked toward his father, but Magnus had stopped gloating, almost as though Silas had just convinced him as well. Ellipsis. That night, Silas lay in silence, looking up at the bland ceiling of his room. Is this excitement? He couldn't remember the last time he had felt that. Even all the rare snakes he worked with, snakes that could kill an elephant with a bite, didn't get his heart rate racing like this. The world just felt boring to him. Sometimes, he wished he was a religious person just so that he could feel assured that something bigger was waiting out there. This just might be that. Silas looked over as his room door creaked open. A little munchkin dressed in a pink nightgown that almost dragged across the floor peeked her head in. Silas smiled lightly. It seemed that the crying fit Alara had gotten into earlier today made her not want to sleep alone. Fine, but you're getting too big for this, you know. Alara pouted her lips and scurried into his bed anyway. She dove into his covers and claimed a half of his bed, ignoring him as though he wasn't even there. This seemed to calm Silas somewhat, and he felt that sleep wasn't so far off after all. Silas, am I going to see my friends again? Maybe, he replied after some pause. Humph, Mom and Dad said definitely. I knew they were lying. Silas smiled bitterly. It seemed he might get scolded again for that one. I'm sure they'll be fine, Silas finally said. After all, it wasn't like these families were escaping into outer space, right? Ultimately, they were all on the same planet. That meant there was a chance for everyone to survive. Although, Silas knew that those odds, according to his calculations, were entirely too slim. Chapter 2, Butler Joseph. Silas ducked his head and took the first step on his way down from the private jet. He wore a pair of jeans and a white turtleneck, and matched both with a pair of loafers and a light brown trench coat. The wind was a bit chilly up here in the Appalachians, so he had dressed appropriately. Oddly enough, the air wasn't as brisk as he was expecting, and it felt more like spring. The words of the manic hot dog merchant flashed in his mind again, but he didn't pause his steps, looking around with his usual placid gaze. The Browns family estate was located high in the mountains. It was about as secluded as you could get. Quite frankly, without a private jet, it was impossible to get here unless you were willing to take a commercial plane and then go on a week-long hike. As expected of a family of this stature, they had their own runway and airplane hangar. There was even a small mansion not too far out of sight, where Silas assumed they allowed the pilots to rest. This was good news for him because he had booked their pilot for the entire weekend so as to avoid any potential mishaps. It was hard to get a lay of the land while on this piece of it. The tarmac, the hangar, and the pilot accommodations were all that were worth seeing here. They would likely have to take one of the helicopters he saw lined up to the side to the main abode. The rest of Silas' family came down with him. After his father spoke a few words to their pilot, they separated and waited for the greeting entourage. All around them, there were similar groups, most of whom were well-off families that had long since separated from the Browns. Many of them were likely like Silas, not having understood this sort of connection until recently. The number is quite a few, Silas thought to himself. He counted nearly 50, and those were just the few that had arrived at a similar time to his own family. Silas looked over to find a butler headed over with swift steps. He was dressed as traditionally as one could imagine, his black hair and meticulously trimmed beard holding hints of an aged grey. He bowed gracefully when he was in range. "Welcome. My name is Joseph. You may all address me as such. Please follow me. I will escort you to your accommodations promptly." Odd, Silas thought as he followed along. The other groups should have arrived before us, but they are still waiting. Why is that? He looked over to find that his grandfather was practically grinning ear to ear. He managed to restrain himself eventually, but Silas took note of it. The family entered a helicopter and was soon in the air again. Not even a dozen minutes later, they landed on the roof of just one of the many properties Silas could see from below. His sister couldn't see on her own, so she had insisted on sitting on his lap. If not for the decorum everyone else was showing, she would have pressed her chubby little cheeks against the windows just to get a clearer look. This home beneath us now will be your living quarters. There are 5 bedrooms and bathrooms, an outdoor bathhouse with sauna and pool included, along with an ample living area in the backyard. Should you have any specifications on what you would like the backyard to include, please inform me and I will have the construction workers and architects get started on a plan right away. Butler Joseph continued to lead him through the house, explaining a great many things, but Silas was still stuck on his first few sentences. Get an architect to start up a plan immediately. Their intention is truly to accommodate us all for an extended period. Indefinitely, potentially. We've missed brunch, and I have yet to understand the particularities of your family. But I have taken it upon myself to schedule lunch at 1300 hours. As a last point of emphasis, there are many questions that I am not qualified to answer, so please understand my position. I have been told that come tomorrow evening, everything will be properly addressed. With that, Butler Joseph bowed once more and swiftly headed to the servants' quarters, likely to continue preparing lunch. The tour was so comprehensive that there truly weren't any questions to ask other than the ones that burned at their souls. However, after Joseph's final words, they could only look at one another with somewhat blank expressions. It seemed that everything would have to wait for tomorrow evening. Ellipsis. The day passed by swiftly. Normally, Silas would be a bit agitated. He had a meticulousness about him that many couldn't understand. He liked to dress well, he liked to keep his things tidy, and he was always punctual and direct. The fact that this meeting would take place Sunday evening, when he had lectures scheduled on Monday, didn't leave him much room to maneuver unless he had the pilot take off in the middle of the night. However, he had surprisingly had very few thoughts of anxiety related to this matter. His mind was entirely focused on the coming meeting, and then the hour finally came. Holding on to his little sister's hand, Silas followed along the outdoor trail Joseph led them all down. Though he described it in this way, the dirt road was so well maintained that it might as well have been pavement instead. It seemed the only reason it wasn't was in order to keep the ambience of nature intact. There were many other groups of families walking down these paths and coming out from their own homes, similar to them. The atmosphere was both polite and slightly rigid. Everyone knew that they were all related distantly by blood, but it was difficult to feel that sort of closeness. With the meeting so close, there were also other things on their minds as well. Chapter 3, Turncoats. Silas had been thinking about a great many things in the last day, and he felt that he had cobbled together some puzzle pieces. For one, just to make it here, one had to have a certain status, or at the very least be willing to take such a risk. A single flight hour for a pilot costed thousands. Even if you were near the estate, relatively speaking, you'd easily be 5 figures down the drain for this single trip, at best. No normal family could charter a plane on a whim like this. That was just the first filter, though. The second filter, and arguably the more important one, was daring to come in the first place. Objectively speaking, his grandfather's words were ridiculous. An apocalyptic event, only known by the truest elites of the world. Next thing the old man would be saying was that the Illuminati was real too. However, even though it sounded ridiculous, there were countless methods of checking the veracity of the claim. Silas' method was just one. If you knew what you were looking for, Silas could think of at least half a dozen other viable methods. There might be some among the families that came today who were just looking to come up in the world. Maybe they thought the Browns would provide them an opportunity to soar beyond the current station. In Silas' opinion, these people should be the minority. The rest were similar to himself, sharp-eyed and looking to satiate their curiosity. The families were led into a large dining hall, each assigned to their own tables. Separated again, Silas noted. It was subtle, but there seemed to be a conscious effort to make it difficult for these various small families to interact with one another and start asking questions. Silas didn't believe there was anything sinister about it, at least not yet. It was more likely to be a form of crowd control. A full 3-course meal was served and the dining hall was filled with sounds of quiet chatter. Silas' eyes landed on a few figures at the head tables, 3 in particular that he recognized instantly. Lucius Brown, Malachi Brown, and Astrid Brown, 2 men and a woman, each unique in their own way. They all shared one long table, facing the dining room as though this was the Renaissance era and they were kings and queens. Oddly enough, they seemed to have no intention of addressing everyone. In a situation where everyone was meticulously following etiquette, this action, or inaction rather, stuck out like a sore thumb. Dessert was served, a nice light and airy cheesecake drizzled with strawberry jam. It looked delicious, though Silas didn't eat it. He tended to stay away from sugar. He found that his body was a bit too sensitive to it. His little sister, though, happily stole away his piece. He really didn't know where this little munchkin found the room in that bite-sized body of hers. Someone stood from their seat. Silas didn't need to look to know who it was. He had been focused on these people for the entire night. The moment his ears twitched, he knew it had to be Astrid. Astrid was about the same age as Silas' mother, and their looks were so similar that they could easily pass as sisters. They were 2 women in their mid-40s that looked to be in their early 30s instead. Their style of dress was simple and elegant, and their choice in jewelry was muted and not very bombastic. Astrid wore a black gown that managed to not carry the gloominess one might expect. A pearl necklace graced her slender neck, and her hair carried quite a bit of volume, almost as though she had hosed it down with hairspray, and yet it didn't carry the expected stiffness as it loosely flowed to her shoulders. She was beautiful, but her brows carried an undisguised authority. There was a saying that most of the richest women in the world were widows or divorcees, but Astrid was neither, never having been married. She had every right to stand shoulder to shoulder with Lucius and Malachi. The 2 even seemed to defer to her somewhat. Not defer, Silas thought to himself. More like they're content to let her take the lead. They see one another as equals. What an interesting dynamic. What are they competing for that such a hierarchy is necessary? I know you all have many questions, so I will speak once for all of you. Though these words sound arrogant, the family needs you all to understand that the current ways of the world cannot continue as presently constructed. In the future, we will not all be equals. What you have must be earned, and only what you've earned, can you use. Astrid's gaze swept through the dining hall. She was setting the tone, and her authority made it difficult for anyone to even think of refuting her. Earth has undergone 6 extinction-level events over the course of its history. The Ordovician extinction, the Devonian extinction, the Permian-Triassic extinction, the Triassic-Jurassic extinction, the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction, the Holocene extinction. Many frowned when they heard this. They were all educated people. They had heard of these extinction events in passing, though not many had heard of them in so many words. But those that had felt odd that they were being grouped together like this. The Holocene extinction, for example, was an extinction event currently ongoing, caused at the hands of humans and their impact on Earth's wildlife. Why mention these things? Your textbooks have told you that these extinction events were caused by various things. Volcanoes, ice ages, asteroids, countless horrible things. However, I am here to tell you today that this is all nonsense. Every one of these extinction events, even the so-called, ongoing, one, have all been caused by one single matter. The summoned Ascension. Astrid's expression became solemn. Many of you will choose to leave after tonight. I want to make it clear that the family will not stop you. We are not a charity, nor do we believe that those who carry our blood need such coddling. Once you step out of that door, there is no return. Whatever happens afterward will have nothing to do with us. We have no patience for turncoats. Chapter 4, Stele. Silas watched all of this silently. She's quite a good speaker. She mentioned something as fanciful as a summoned ascension, and then she rooted it right back in reality. Somehow it sounds less ridiculous when she puts it like that. Now I assume she'll go back to explaining what a summoned ascension is. The summoned ascension is a multiverse-level event. It is an opportunity for Earth to enter the world stage. The true world stage. The first opportunity was over 400 million years ago, and it ended in failure. The sixth opportunity, during the era of the United States of America, China, and Russia, was the closest that we've gotten to success, but we were ripped apart by internal strife. You've read books about the matters of culture and race, and how heavy a part they've played in our history. What you don't know is that even when our lives were on the line, nothing changed. Silas' gaze suddenly turned sharp as he sat forward. These were simple words, but they practically hit him like a truck. Hundreds of years ago, the most powerful nations in the world were eradicated due to an all-out nuclear war. America, China, Russia, Britain, they all had their centers of power crushed. Although they were in the Appalachians now, this country was no longer called America. Instead, it was called the United Coalition of Terra Nova. These names were purposely decided upon to exude a similar air to the countries they replaced, almost as a silent salute to the lives lost and a reminder to never go down that path again. Even to today, when society had basically caught back up to the pre-nuclear fallout days, no country owned any nuclear warheads. Well, at least not publicly. This, though, was just the beginning. In this age, race wasn't truly a thing. If you looked around, most people were quite ethnically ambiguous. If Silas was picked up and dropped into the era before the sixth extinction event, looking at him, it would be difficult to tell if he was Eastern European, Middle Eastern, Hispanic, or maybe even a mixed-race descendant of some sort. This was the same for everyone. His parents, his little sister, his grandfather, Astrid, or even the other invitees. All of this was publicly available information, the kind of open secret you didn't even think about while walking through the streets every day, but Astrid's words just now. They made his heart start racing so long after it had finally calmed down. If after the sixth extinction event, Earth failed again, this time due to internal strife caused by cultural and racial differences, what better way to deal with that than to try to make everyone of one culture and one race? There was even now a universal language across all of Earth. It was a valiant effort, but humans were truly disgusting creatures. Without race, it became a matter of class. Wasn't the perfect example right here? The powerful families were gathering up now, and Astrid had mentioned bloodline once already. What about the poor? What about the people who didn't have a trillionaire-class family to suddenly call them back home? This will be our seventh attempt to ascend. There is much on the line, but I will keep this short. Every world only has 9 attempts to ascend. After failure on the 9th attempt, it will lose its right to sovereignty and will be passed on to the other overlords of the galactic region. Second, those of you informed about the past extinction events understand that we are quite lucky. Not all dominant species manage to survive an event. Many creatures of the past are no longer with us, the dinosaurs being the first that likely comes to your mind. The human race managed to make it through one extinction event, but it is impossible to guarantee that we can make it through another. Astrid waved a hand and the dining room's lights dimmed somewhat as a projector began to fall to her back. Right now, all of you only have my words, and as I've said, I'm not here to coddle you all. But I do believe that it is only fair that you all get to witness exactly what me and my cousins have before you make your decision. The projector clicked into place and an image fired onto it. No, it wasn't an image, but it was a box, a bronze box that appeared, hovered and rotated in space. Silas frowned. He looked up at the ceiling and checked for wires, then he went through all the magic tricks in the book to try to find the catch, but nothing came to him. This box is known as a city stele. Most accurately, a bronze city stele. It can be said that it's because our ancestor managed to survive the 6th extinction that we have this in our possession. In fact, this bronze city stele is without a doubt the most valuable possession of the Brown family. All of you, touch it. The lights returned to normal, and the projector slid back up. Astrid pressed a hand against the bronze city stele and it shot across the dining room to the first table. The wait was agonizing. Silas had to sit there patiently, watching as one gaze after another lit up like a raging inferno. His leg began to move up and down, moving so fast that by the time the bronze city stele got to their table, his breathing was a bit rushed. Even so, he controlled himself, watching as his little sister eagerly leapt at it first, then his mother, then his father. Silas, Alara pulled at his sleeve. It's so cool. It went like boom, then flash, and then all these words and letters appeared in my head like I was dreaming, but I wasn't dreaming. For the first time, Silas completely ignored his little sister. His grandfather smiled, pushing the floating cube toward him without even taking a glance at it himself. His gaze carrying a hint of pleasure and a knowing look. Silas reached forward and touched the cube, his mind going blank. No, it was like his mind and his body had been split in two, his mind seeing things that his body wasn't. Somehow, he was certain that whatever this was couldn't be seen by his eyes, but was rather his mind's eye instead. Like Alara said, it felt like he was dreaming. And then the words came. Bronze City Stele. Status, dormant. Village name, unnamed. Territory level, rudimentary village, territory diameter, 100 meters. Residents, 0/100. Soldiers, 0/10. Popularity, 0/0. Subsidiary village limit, 2. Territory stats, basic amenities plus 5%, basic limits plus 100%. Silas was in complete awe. There was simply no technology on this level anywhere. Even VR gaming was still stuck in a projected image era. It was nowhere close to being able to send something right into your brain. There was some improvement on the front of being able to use computer chips to replace eyesight, but there was simply nothing like this. Basic amenities, basic limits, what is that? Silas' desire to understand everything was blazing like a bonfire. His curiosity was practically eating him alive. What he didn't expect was to get an answer. Basic amenities, crop output, village attraction, talent buff. Basic limits, territory diameter, residents, soldiers, subsidiary village limit. Silas was stunned into silence, not by the response, but rather by what the response meant. It read my mind. It read my mind and then responded in kind. How is that possible? He already knew from that moment that he wouldn't be returning home. Chapter 5, Token Gestures. The moon was full that night, tinged with a slight hint of blue that gave it an ethereal beauty. Silas marveled at it, feeling that it held a different sort of significance today. It was no longer just a rock in the skies, a piece of earth stripped away and tied by gravity. Instead, it felt more like a stepping stone, or maybe even a distraction, obscuring what was beyond with its gorgeous light. Silas felt someone sit by him. The stone bench had more than enough room, though it was odd that someone would be up so late at night. It was well past midnight. He usually liked to get to sleep on quite a strict schedule so that he could wake up early in the morning. People neglected sleep too often, when it was probably the most powerful super serum in existence. But since he couldn't sleep either, who was to say that others wouldn't feel the same? Grandfather, Silas said lightly. Magnus smiled. By now, he was used to his grandson's stiff form of address. He knew Silas' heart better than almost anyone else, so he wouldn't be caught up by such trivial things. What are you thinking about, Silas? Silas never took his eyes off of the moon. It wasn't that he couldn't answer, but that the answer would be too long, and ultimately wouldn't get to the gist of what his grandfather wanted to talk about. You've known for a long time, was what Silas eventually said. Magnus sighed. It sounded aged and weary, and it was probably the first time his grandfather had truly exuded the presence of his age. The fathers of Lucius, Malachi, and Astrid, they are my brothers. Compared to the other families brought here, it could be said that we are the closest to the main family in blood. Your father, he should have been the fourth among them. He, too, should have had the title of Grimblade. Grimblade, Silas asked. Yes, this is the name of our lineage. In order to better blend in with modern society, we changed our name to Brown. This is probably something that they will tell you in the coming days, but they already dumped enough on you. Silas nodded slowly. Truth be told, this was much easier to accept now. If his grandfather had told him a few days ago, he might have tried to check him into a hospital. Grimblade. It was a rustic name, and the emotion it gave off could only be taken one of two ways. Either you would feel that it was the fantasy of a 5-year-old boy, or it was overbearing and valiant. Silas was neutral. All those years ago, it was my fault. I had a child with your grandmother, a woman that my father did not approve of. I withstood a great amount of pressure and slaved for the family to make up for this mistake. Magnus shook his head. Ultimately, the result was me abandoning your father for 10 years, and not being there when your grandmother died. Silas looked toward his grandfather's side profile. He had never seen Magnus cry before. Even now, the latter's words were steady and even, but the tears continued to stream down his face in an uncontrollable flow. To cancer. Imagine that, my woman, the love of my life, died to such a vile, detestable thing when her man came from the most powerful family in this world. When in just a few decades, such a disease could be cured with just a wave of the hand. Silas knew that his grandfather must be referring to this coming. Summoned Ascension, they called it. Their world didn't have a cure for cancer, but this world seemed to. Magnus shook his head again. When I got word of your grandmother's death, I abandoned the family and my birthright. My father forbade me from bringing Cedric back to the family, so we could only forge out on our own. And you feel no resentment? Silas asked. Ha! Magnus laughed, his chuckle carrying a hint of darkness. Who would I resent? That man has long since died and I didn't even attend his funeral. Even if I did hold some resentment, this family deserves a chance to survive. Why would I let my own pettiness get in the way when the culprit is gone? Silas didn't respond, carefully listening to his grandfather's words. These matters had been on his chest for a long time, but no one would believe him. Even his own son didn't believe him. If Silas looked at this from his father's perspective, it would seem like the Browns were obsessed with money and class to the point they carefully controlled the marriages of the descendants. But now that he had seen the bronze stele, it was a matter much deeper than that. This was truly a matter of life and death, with the fate of the entire human race on the line. Considering the name, Grimblade, and the fact his grandfather called it a lineage, it might also mean that bloodline was incredibly important as well, and his grandfather's actions may have compromised that. With that perspective, everything was much more reasonable. Silas spent a lot of time with snakes. Carefully breeding them to select for beautiful patterns or more powerful venoms wasn't something only he dabbled in, but one that many other reptile enthusiasts and scientists alike took part in. If the matter of bloodline became so important in this new world as well, and on a much larger scale, he couldn't help but feel that the efforts their predecessors had gone through in eliminating race would all be for naught. But wasn't that the usual? The powerful making token gestures to the weak as they hoarded all the power for themselves. Chapter 6, Only One. Anyway, this old man has already properly vented. Magnus patted Silas' shoulder. This isn't what I came here to talk to you about. Instead, I want to speak to you about the bronze stele. You are sharp, I'm sure you've already realized. That there's only one, Silas finished. Magnus' smile widened, his teary eyes flashing with pride. He loved his family dearly, and this grandson of his never failed to impress him. Indeed, there is only one. There will only be one city lord, and the choice will only come from those three. Even if I hadn't made that mistake all those years ago, it would be your father, and not you, that would have an opportunity to compete for this chance. Silas nodded. He wasn't surprised. The president of the United Coalition of Terra Nova had a minimum cut-off age of 35 years old. According to the science, Silas' brain had only recently stopped growing, and he didn't have nearly enough life experience yet. Plus, while he was a tenured professor at such a tender age, what was that compared to 3 billionaires? If the Browns only had one city stele, and they were going to put their hopes in someone, even if it wasn't someone of the immediate family, it definitely wouldn't be someone as young as Silas. Magnus chuckled. He knew that his grandson had a great deal of self-pride. It was reflected in the way he was so strict with himself and in his discipline. But he was also logical to a fault. He wouldn't be mad about something like this even though Magnus knew Silas only had one thought in his mind right now. I'm definitely the best choice. I can tell you what the plans of the family are in advance and you can make the choice for yourself. If you go off on your own, though, I'm sure you can understand the consequences. This is a matter of life and death, so the punishment for dissension will be proportional. Silas nodded. Even if Silas proved himself to be a talent, the family would want him to consolidate under them and help. If he placed his efforts elsewhere, it would be as good as going against them. The city stele is the most valuable commodity in the Ascension realm. The most common of them are actually just titled, Common City Stele. Over 99% of cities will be like this. Is that the reason for the buffers? Silas asked. Yes, the Bronze City Stele is an upgrade, so it receives more territory per level, more residents, etc. However, the trial to gain one is excessive and heavy. For the Grimblade lineage to gain one of the bronze grade, it required a sacrifice they weren't willing to make until it was already clear that we would fail our 6th attempt. Silas' brows rose slightly at these words, and his grandfather nodded in response. We lost thousands of warriors and the lineage was almost completely wiped out, but it was only worth it because the extinction event was coming, anyway. It was either we took the risk, or we would be buried. From these words, and for this level of sacrifice, it was obvious that the Browns, or the Grimblades, rather, could never give this city stele to a relative outsider like Silas. They had given up too much. Soon, the summoned ascension will begin, and this will be a period the family uses to evaluate which of the three will be most suited to becoming city lord. This period is also important because the location of your city is as important as anything else. The world changes, Silas asked. Magnus laughed. Once again, his grandson had hit the nail on the head. Yes, the Ascension realm is randomized every time. The terrain, the ecosystems, even the dangers are always completely different. Even if they weren't, it would be very difficult for a comprehensive map to exist in the first place. Then what do you want me to do? Silas asked. Magnus smiled bitterly. No, Silas, this isn't something I'm strapping you with. I can just feel that this would be a choice you'd want to make and I'm giving you my blessing to do so. If and only if you want to. Your father is a good man. I don't know how much credit I can take for that, but he isn't ambitious. He would be content to follow the plans of the family. Your mother is a good woman, and she will always support him well. The little munchkin is too young and won't even be among the summoned unless Cedric and Isolde consent, and you know they won't. It's not that father isn't ambitious, Silas said lightly, it's rather that he has no reason to be, he is easily content, and that's a good trait to have. Magnus agreed, but in this world, there really was no difference. If Cedric needed a trigger to become ambitious, by that point, it would already be too late. Either way, what I'm trying to say, Silas, is that I am too old, and your parents don't have the necessary character. Although age will become far less of a factor very soon, by that point, much of the outcome will be decided and it will no longer be my turn to decide things. You need to take this upcoming buffer period to figure out what you want to do. Silas listened intently, and he and his grandfather spoke deep into the night. Chapter 7, Even If I Die. The days passed swiftly. Every day, a new meeting would take place and the members of the family were briefed and prepared. However, it wasn't until the very last day that everyone learned of the weight of what they were about to do. This matter wasn't a joke, nor was it a game. It was one of the final opportunities they had to save planet Earth, and the risk was proportional. In these days, the family didn't train them. It was useless. What progress could someone with no fighting experience make in a mere week or so? Even Silas knew that this was a great weakness of his. He was at best an amateur boxer, and that was if he was generous with himself. All he had in his favor was his athletic build and decent stamina. Silas wondered why they wouldn't have just called him over sooner, but then he realized that they already had. They had spared as much resources as they were willing to on the matter. They, the members of the Grimblades branch families, were mostly ill-prepared, but was the same true of Lucius, Malachi, and Astrid? What of the direct subordinates? This was a clear dividing line. Calling them back was for nothing more than bolstering their administration with those intelligent enough to know to return. Tonight, Lucius Grimblade began, you will be given two choices. The first choice will be to enter the ether plane, and the second will be to remain here. If you pick the first, you will be thrown into a trial world, one where you're ill-prepared and have a better than 90% chance of dying. If you choose the second, you will be giving up on this chance and will have another option down the line to subordinate yourselves to a city lord. The Grimblade family will not make this choice for you. Regardless of what choice you make, we will be of one family and of one mind. These are the last matters we need to explain to you. As for the rest, once the Ascension begins, everything else will fall into place. You are dismissed. Lucius' words were much more forceful than Astrid's, and he often spoke like a strict sergeant. His words were already laced enough with his intentions that he didn't need to make anything else clear. It was obvious the Grimblade family wanted him to choose the second option. Ellipsis. Silas lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling. He subconsciously looked at his phone, checking the string of missed calls and unopened emails that would have usually filled him to the brim with anxiety. But right now, he was calm. Even though he had lied to his parents, to his little sister, even if he knew that death likely waited for him on the other side, he was calm. For the first time in his life, he was going to make the stupid, illogical decision. He had no combat experience, no hidden ace, nothing but the fragile brain squishing about in his skull. For some reason, his grandfather had known that he would make this choice, and he was probably the only one. His father and mother were so confident he would choose logic over the brashness of youth that they hadn't even bothered to have more than a casual conversation with him about it. Amusingly enough, his little sister was closer to his grandfather in this regard, and he had to assure her many times that he definitely wouldn't go. But he would go. He had to. He didn't have some savior complex, nor did he abhor the idea of being ruled by someone else so badly. After years in academia, he had gotten used to following rules, even when they were ridiculous. He had the discipline of a soldier. No. The real reason he was going was simply because he wanted to, because the idea filled him with excitement and pumped his cool blood with the heat a young man his age should have. Tick, tick. The clock on the wall seemed to slow before a blinding blue light rushed over the whole of Earth. If one observed the change from the moon, it would look as though a laser beam had suddenly collided with them, enveloping their entire world. And then the words appeared in his mind once again. Experiencing it for the second time, it felt so surreal. It was definitely only in his head, and yet with his eyes open, it felt like it had been inlaid into reality. Summon Ascension initiating. Summoned, Silas Grimblade. Enter trial Ascension. Yes, no. Silas' lip curled. They made it sound so nice. Usually, a trial was supposed to be the easier version, the one where the training wheels would be on. But this was the exact opposite. In the trial Ascension, the world would be stripped of all basic amenities, akin to Earth long before modern day. After this trial Ascension was concluded, many helpful things would be added, such as system cities, where things could be conveniently bought and traded. These were all differences drilled into his head by the Grimblades, likely to ensure that he wouldn't make the choice he was about to make. Silas smiled. Even if I die, I'm sure I'll see something interesting first. Yes. Silas vanished, but Earth remained frozen in time, a state it would remain in until the trial Ascension was complete. Chapter 8, Stat Screen. Silas appeared in a world of white. He didn't panic, as he knew exactly what this space was. Although the training Ascension had no training wheels, it didn't throw you out like bait to the sharks either. He knew his choice was stupid, but he also wasn't kicked in the head. If this chance didn't exist, regardless of how excited he was by the prospect, he wouldn't have come. A screen flashed before him. Name: Silas Grimblade. Species: Human, F. Affiliation: Grimblade lineage. Class: Empty. Level: 0. Titles: Physical: 7. Greater than Strength: 5. Greater than Constitution: 5. Greater than Dexterity: 10. Greater than Speed: 8. Mental: 6. Greater than Intelligence: 5. Greater than Wisdom: 10. Greater than Charisma: 2. Will: 10. Luck: 1. Skills: Comprehensions. Gene state: Rigid. Fragmented genes: Grimblade lineage, F. Common genes. Bronze genes. Silver genes. Gold genes. Legendary genes. Gene talents: Blade aura, mutated, weakened. Silas analyzed every line of this screen. This would be about the only place he could calmly do this. It would be the last chance he had for a while. Much of the information he used to analyze his stats came directly from his grandfather, as the Grimblades mostly spent time teaching them how dangerous the world on the other side was. For one, the stats of this Ascension realm weren't an objective metric of strength, but were rather relative stats. 10 represented the pinnacle of humanity and 1 represented the bottom of the barrel. Essentially, any stat Silas had a 10 in placed him in the 99th percentile. On average, you'd fall about 10 percentile points down for every loss of 1. This would become the new standard for the duration of the trial, and also a scale to help you understand just how much more powerful the surrounding creatures were. However, there were some exceptions, with intelligence, charisma, will, and luck being the main culprits. According to his grandfather, these were the only objective stats. Intelligence wasn't in regard to the normal definition of the word, but rather referred to one's ability to allow the flow of a special energy his grandfather called ether. This ability was mostly decided upon by your race and your genes. The human race was middle of the road in this sense, and the Grimblade lineage gene didn't help. Well, technically, the Grimblade lineage did help. The trouble was that it wasn't strong enough to add to the stat, especially not Silas' weakened version. After all, he was 2 generations removed from the purest Grimblade bloodline. Charisma was similar and relied on race and genes. It wasn't a matter of looks or sweet talking, but rather how well one could impose their will onto another party. Silas apparently had high will, but he could not exert it onto others, at least not with any great effectiveness. He didn't have the methods to do so. Will was the first one of these stats that Silas had thought about, that actually meant what it stated. It referred to a person's tenacity and mental toughness. For the moment, Silas wasn't sure why the stat needed to be listed. It didn't seem as pertinent as the other stats, but he was sure that he would eventually find out. Finally, there was luck. It was the only stat that started off at 1 no matter who you were, what race you came from, or what genes you had. However, it was also the stat both most difficult and most important to improve. Silas continued to scan the list. The physical stats were straightforward, with strength meaning strength, constitution referring to one's durability, dexterity one's flexibility and speed one's, well, speed. The final of the mental stats, wisdom, was the one that focused on his IQ, his flexibility of mind, his ability to learn new things and adapt, as well as his EQ. There were only really 2 other things of interest on the screen, the first being his affiliation and the second being his gene talent. The fact his affiliation already said Grimblade lineage was something his grandfather had warned him about. Normally, by default, he should be unaffiliated. Because he had an affiliation meant the head of an affiliation could check in on him and his status. The good news was that this couldn't be done before the establishment of a city, and he would have time to shed this affiliation. Though not without price. Abandoning your affiliation would activate a hidden line in the stat screen that would make things very difficult for him. His grandfather hadn't had more information than this, but he had been warned about it. Next, there was his gene talent. As expected, it was both mutated and weakened. The dashed line was there because it wasn't even good enough to be F grade. As for what was beyond F grade, Silas had no information about this. That aside, His grandfather had warned him about this as well. Magnus had a child with someone his father didn't approve of. And then, Scylla's father had a child with his mother, who was presumably also someone the Grimblades wouldn't approve of. It could be considered a small miracle that Scylla's even had some portion of this gene talent. Scylla's slotted these things to the back of his mind and then looked toward the three floating objects before him, the real reason he was in this world of white. He already knew what they were. One was the option to pick a weapon of his choice, the second was an option related to his genes, and the final was the option of a common city stele. Without hesitation, Scylla chose the second of the three options and he felt something burrow into his body. This option wasn't for a new gene talent or even a gene upgrade. Rather, it would change his gene state. According to his grandfather, this would be the easiest method of changing his gene state. There would never be something so good obtained so casually again. Gene state represented one's ability to accept new genes into the body. The weaker the state, the more difficult it was to absorb genes and mutate existing ones. Rigid, inflexible, brittle, soft, flexible, malleable, chaotic, and finally free. These were the available gene states. At rigid, it was impossible for you to change anything about your genes no matter how many chances you had. At free, your body was practically like clay in your hands, ready to change and be molded to your wishes. This gene state enhancer would allow him to have a soft gene state for a 1-week period before wearing off. In that state, any gene he absorbed would have a 50% chance of being successful. Now it was a question of if he would manage to get his hands on any. Chapter 9, A Patient Stalker. Scylla felt his vision blur once again, and soon the world took shape around him. It was a forest, dense and humid. Overgrown vegetation was ubiquitous, and the sun had a hard time penetrating the ground from the high skies above. Scylla took this in with no small bit of satisfaction. If he had spawned in an area without cover, his odds of dying would be much higher. He looked down at himself and found that he was wearing a cheap set of light brown clothing, made of a thin cotton. There was a distinct lack of shoes on his feet which made the moist soil particularly grating on his psyche, and he wasn't adorned with anything else special. According to his grandfather, the spawn point shouldn't have any significant predators within about a kilometer or so. Of course, the moment you touched down, these predators would no longer be restricted by such rules. So, caution was the name of the game. Weapon. This was the first thing Scylla's mind went to. His grandfather hadn't told him which of the three options to pick. It was only after much deliberation that he made the choice he had. It was the riskiest, but it was also the one with the greatest growth potential. If he had chosen the city stele, he would have been given free warriors to fight on his behalf. The benefit of a weapon was obvious as well. It could be said that this was the only option that didn't really give him any method of protecting himself. Scylla began to move, getting a lay of the land. He had to take advantage of this buffer to try to see if he could find any usable landmarks. Water, shelter, a natural fort potentially, all of these were things on his mind as he continued to move. In addition, though, he was also paying attention to potential markers that denoted territory. Claw marks, footprints, dung, anything he could take note of. On the way, Scylla picked up 2 stones. He flexed his arms and bashed them together with his greatest strength, ignoring the aching in his wrist until they broke into pieces. He let them drop to the floor and picked out the one that both fit nicely in his palm and had a decent edge to it. He was lucky that there were no beasts around and this rainforest was an excellent muffler of noise, or else he would likely not dare to do this. Running water. Scylla's ears picked it up, and he looked in that direction. He crouched down and leaned over a thick bush to take a look at the clearing. He had traveled about 200 or so meters. There were no creatures in sight, at least not immediately. A few seconds later, Scylla felt his heartbeat slow as a large elk came into view. That elk, it's at least 2 meters tall. It should be an extinct species. Mental surpasses target. Analysis successful, Irish elk, F. Level, 0. Physical, 14. Mental, 0. Wool, 3. Scylla was a biochemist with a doctorate, but he wasn't well informed on every extinct species to ever live. What he did know was that elk didn't come with bodies that large and antlers so expansive. Even so, this was something he had expected. According to his grandfather, the trial Ascension wouldn't spawn creatures of other worlds, but rather ones pulled from Earth itself, extinct or otherwise. Considering there was a large number more of species that had gone extinct versus ones that were still among the living now, almost all the creatures that Silas met should be among the first number. A mental of 0. Silas remained hidden and continued to observe. The body of water before him was a lake about 30 or so meters across. There was a stream that connected to it, expanding into a river that ran through the forest, but this should be the main body of water these creatures used to hydrate themselves. Silas made a mental note of it and made a move to follow the elk as it finished up. A mental of 0 meant that the elk should be unable to use ether. As they continued through the trial Ascension, this would change and these creatures would become more dangerous. Its physical was unsurprisingly far ahead of Silas. Double, in fact. The stats were scaled to human levels, so it was easy to tell just how much more powerful even an unenhanced creature was compared to the average human. Silas was patient. Although the looming deadline of a week was practically ticking above his head, he knew that being rash would just get him killed. He followed a long way behind the elk and often couldn't see it in his line of sight. He focused instead on its hoof prints, maintaining caution as his #1 priority. Elks were creatures he vaguely understood. Since this one was a male, it would likely sleep alone. All he had to do was wait for the opportunity and hope another creature didn't interfere with him. Luckily, it seemed that this elk had a strong dominion over the immediate area. It meandered about, eating vegetation here and there, marking its territory with its dung from time to time, and all around asserting itself. Silas should have been bored to death. Having been born and raised in a world of smartphones and social media, following a creature without cognition strong enough for even this system to register should have been draining. Even so, in a place where slacking off even once could cost him his life, he somehow managed to remain completely focused. Not only did he follow the elk as it moved about, he kept a constant vigilance of his surroundings, even carefully avoiding any creatures unlucky enough to appear close enough to the elk. The hours ticked by and his patience never wavered, even as the sun began to set and darkness descended. Unlocked. Title: A Patient Stalker. You have displayed astonishing will and tenacity, +1 will. +1 dexterity. Plus 10% success in absorbing related genes. Chapter 10, No Room for Error. Name: Silas Grimblade. Species: Human. F. Physical, 7. Greater than, Strength, 5. Greater than, Constitution, 5. Greater than, Dexterity, 11. Greater than, Speed, 8. Mental, 6. Greater than, Intelligence, 5. Greater than, Wisdom, 10. Greater than, Charisma, 2. Will, 11. Luck, 1. Silas' eyes narrowed when he saw the notification alerting his mind. He felt that it would be a bit dangerous if this happened in a situation where he needed hyper-concentration, but he could only make do for now. The title system was something else his grandfather had told him about. In general, a title's rareness could be decided by the kind of boosts it gave. The fact that this one could even increase the odds of absorbing genes, even if it was only genes of a specific type, meant that it was on the rarer side. Interestingly enough, titles that gave boosts to hidden stats like dexterity rather than overall stats like physical or mental were on the more common side of things. The fact that this title checked both boxes told Silas that he would have to weigh several things in the future. He found it odd that titles didn't come with grades like much everything else seemed to, but he took it in stride. After all, he had other things to focus on right now. Night fell, but by dusk, the elk had already found a region to sleep. This is odd, Silas thought to himself. The sleeping pattern was too human. Most animals didn't fall into a normal human-like sleep pattern. Silas wasn't sure of the exact sleep pattern of elks, but he felt that the fact it was going to rest at this time was peculiar. Even after the elk had fallen asleep, Silas continued to wait. After about a quarter hour, he noticed something interesting. An energy fell down from the skies and matched the steady breathing rhythm of the elk. Ether, Silas concluded as he put 2 and 2 together. He wasn't being schemed against by this elk, its intelligence was that of a normal animal. It was impossible for it to lure him into a trap. Rather, it seemed that this system might have forced these beasts into uncharacteristic routines so that they could be evolved over time while they slept. This way, every day, they would grow stronger. Now or never. Silas never hesitated when he made a decision, especially not one with such high stakes. The elk had done all the heavy lifting for him. This region was about as secluded as you could get in this dense forest. If he waited for the elk to revolve first, he didn't know if his plan would work. In the depths of the night, it was almost impossible to see. The sun could hardly penetrate the thick foliage in the day, let alone the moon now. However, the gentle rain of ether, though subtle, was just enough for Silas to know where he was going. That, and the fact he had carefully scouted out this region in the day as well, prepared him for this eventuality. He burst into action and appeared behind the elk. He guessed that even if he made some noise, the likelihood that the elk would awaken mid-evolution was next to nil. Even so, he remained as stealthy as he could, rushing in from the back of the sleeping creature. At that moment, something inside him stirred. It was something that he had stealthily tested throughout the day, his blade aura gene talent. The stone he held in his hand gained a subtle twinge of something special as he leapt onto the back of the elk and swung for its skull at the same time. The sound of bone splintering echoed. Dexterity was a stat that decided not just one's flexibility, but also how effectively one could use their strength and speed. The antlers of the elk were large, and they provided great cover. However, even while swinging with all his might, Silas Stone managed to find a way through just the slightest gap, driving down with a strong force. The pulse of pain woke the elk. A cry that sounded like a mix between a cow's moo and a whale's roar echoed out. Silas frowned. His plan was to end it in a single strike. His blade aura might be weaker than a true-blooded Grimblade should be, and his weapon might be hardly considered a weapon at all, but it should have been enough. The ether. This was the only conclusion that made sense. Even though the evolution was incomplete, it had already had such an exaggerated effect. Silas tightly bound his thighs to the back of the elk and held onto one of its branching antlers with his free hand. Using the latter as leverage, he raised his hand axe into the skies and drove it down again. At that moment, he felt an unprecedented calm. Even when he thought about having to kill a living, breathing animal with a weapon as crude as a hand axe, he didn't flinch away from it. He simply felt that it was a necessity. There was no need to question it. The elk rushed up, its will for survival burning bright, and yet it was too disoriented and foolish to understand where the danger was. Its body flared with an unknown energy, and all it knew was that there was pain coming from its head. It lowered its antlers, nearly throwing Silas off its back completely as it rushed headfirst toward a tree. It missed. Silas' first two blows were enough that it couldn't control its body properly anymore, and it ran by the tree instead, its right set of antlers getting clipped on the bark and causing its neck to be ripped to the side. In this moment, Silas noted several things. For one, the body of the elk was already much stronger than it should be. Its speed and acceleration were greater than what he had observed before, but its durability hadn't caught up. The violent force of its antlers being caught in the tree broke off a large segment of it and worsened its injuries. However, it also put Silas in danger. His legs were currently clamped around the neck of the elk. If it had a close shave with another tree, there was no doubt that he'd lose one of his legs or maybe them both at this kind of speed. As fast as his mind was moving, Silas knew that he couldn't jump off now. The elk was definitely in its death throes, but with ether as a variable, who knew how far it could run? How many animals would it alert? More importantly than that, wouldn't he lose the right to benefit from its corpse if it disappeared into the distance? He had wasted an entire day waiting for this opportunity. He only had 7 of them before his soft gene state wore off. There was no room for error. He raised his hand again as another tree swiftly approached, but this time he forgot everything. There was just the blade in his hand and the spot of red on the elk's skull. In the night, his pair of green eyes sparkled like gems. And then his hand axe descended. Chapter 11. The crack was resounding, the stone blade in Silas' palm even splitting once more as the elk collapsed, skidding along its front knees before one of its antlers was caught in the ground, sending Silas flying off. Silas' shoulder rolled forward and he popped back up swiftly. The first thing he did was scan the area. It was hard to see anything at all, so he listened carefully. His breathing was even and his heartbeat was slow despite the situation he had been in. Everything felt slow as the seconds ticked by, but ultimately, there was nothing. It seems that the night might come with some extra safety. It would be best to be nocturnal in this situation, but if I sleep in the day where the animals are most active, won't I put myself in danger? Silas had already not slept for over a day. He hadn't had anything to drink either, and other than some bugs he had conveniently eaten while stalking the elk, he hadn't had anything to eat either. He wasn't worried about food. This was a matter of survival, so he wasn't grossed out by eating insects if he had to. In addition, he had a good understanding of what was and wasn't poisonous in terms of the plant life after observing the elk for a day. However, fatigue wasn't something he could ignore. Silas shrugged this off for now and walked to the elk, putting a hand on it. Irish elk. Gene detected. Fragmented gene, speed, F, attempt assimilation. Yes, no. Titled genes like the Grimblade family's Grimblade lineage were on the rarer side. Most genes were like this one, bolstering a certain aspect of one's physical stats. Between titled genes and physical genes like this one, there were attribute genes which were a little rarer and could give one control over a certain type of ether or other mysterious abilities. The rarest genes of them all, though, were genes that could grant gene talents. His grandfather had been very vague about any more specifics than this, but he had said that the world of genes and how one could learn to use and manipulate them were endless. It was a topic that there was the least amount of information on, and yet one should strive to learn the most about. Regardless, physical genes had their usefulness as well, that being that they were the easiest kind of genes to stack. So long as they shared the same name, they could be fused. In addition, they were repeatable. In this forest, it was doubtful that there'd only be a single elk. In that case, it should be true that so long as he kept killing elks, he would continue to get the speed gene. Yes. Silas held his breath. For the first time, he actually felt some of his nerves getting to him. He hadn't felt nervous jumping into this death trap. He hadn't felt nervous stalking an animal that could kill him with a few kicks. He hadn't even felt nervous when he moved to strike it dead. But this 50-50 chance he was staring down right now had a lot riding on it. He had wasted an entire day on this elk, just for this chance right here. That was already one of his 7 days. If he let the 7-day timer run out, he would be back to a rigid gene state and have a 0% chance of absorbing any genes. Well, aside from that unexplained 10% boost his title gave him. To make matters worse, after seeing how powerful the elk got after just an incomplete evolution, just how much worse would his situation be tomorrow when he was surrounded by an entire forest worth of animals that had actually completed theirs? Gene assimilation starting. Gene assimilation failed. Silas stared at the screen for a long time before slowly closing his eyes. He took a deep breath. When he opened them again, his calm was just the same, and he moved on. A 50-50 chance was good odds, but ultimately, by definition, they were good odds of failing as well. His title boost hadn't kicked in, something he could subconsciously tell, so the elk wouldn't be the best bang for his buck either. He needed to shift his attention. If he wallowed in his own misery, he would just be waiting for death. The first thing he did was look toward the elk's corpse. It would be good food, but it was impossible for him to make use of it. The greatest benefit of this dead elk right now is that he should be able to make use of its territory to get some sleep of his own in. He looked at the broken antlers before walking forward and picking up some of the pieces. An elk's antlers were incredibly sturdy, they were the naturally forged weapons of the creature. The fact they broke like this was one part coincidence, and another part due to the elk's evolution. Considering the fact it gave me a speed gene, that meant its evolution tended toward that aspect. It should mean that its speed stat overwhelmed its constitution stat, which is why running into the tree like that caused its antlers to break. Another secondary point was the sturdiness of the trees themselves. Their leaves didn't even rustle after the impact. This is good. Silas found what he was looking for, an antler with a particularly sharp point. Blade aura could only be applied to a weapon. His hand didn't seem capable of withstanding the gene talent without a great amount of pain. It had felt like he stuck his hand in a microwave when he tried. In addition, blade aura seemed to only be as good as the medium through which it was used. The hand axe was too inferior, and it took several solid blows before Silas could kill the elk. Part of that was due to it being in a half-evolved state, but as Silas had already concluded, constitution wasn't the elk's strong point. This sharp antler, however, was a far better conduit. Even so, it wasn't Silas' goal. Bending down, Silas channeled blade aura again before using the sharp end to begin carefully carving around the elk's leg. His target was the elk equivalent of the human femur. The femur was the strongest bone in the body, and though Silas wasn't an expert on elks, he assumed that there was some decent crossover here too. If this bone wasn't the strongest one in the elk's body, it wouldn't be far from it. Silas suddenly felt a wave of fatigue, but he had already expected this. It would be foolish to assume that he could just use blade aura indefinitely without any consequences. Even so, he had already succeeded. Using his high dexterity, he targeted the soft flesh around the hind hip bones of the elk and took one of its legs. Then he hauled it over his shoulder and rushed back to the elk's original territory. As he moved, he thought about another problem he was facing: blood. During the day, he hadn't come across any carnivorous creatures, but that didn't mean there weren't any. The death of the elk could attract them, and the leg he had just taken was not only heavy, it could also bring him burdens in other ways as well. He would have to be fast. Chapter 12, Blade Aura. Silas returned to the core of the elk's territory. Even in the midst of that adrenaline-filled situation, he hadn't lost his head, and he made careful note of exactly where the elk was running. During the day he spent stalking the elk, he had learned a lot about blade aura. The rundown was simple. He could only use it a minute at a time before needing 10 minutes of rest. He couldn't apply it directly to his flesh without being assaulted by a strong burning sensation. While he didn't push himself to see if this would lead to permanent structural damage, when he did test it on a leaf, it shriveled and basically burnt to a crisp. That led him to conclude that there was a certain level of agitation going on that organic material couldn't handle, and this was especially so for organic material with high water content. Beyond that, blade aura running out felt similar to how he felt at the end of a half marathon. He was out of breath, his body ached, and he felt like taking a long rest. However, unlike the end of a half marathon, he recovered much faster. Silas' stat screen didn't have a stamina stat, but his assumption was that stamina was baked into Constitution. He felt that he was a decent long-distance athlete, but this system didn't seem to approve of that analysis. Though, it was hard to tell without understanding how well others fared. Silas patiently waited for the 10 minutes to be up before he went at it again. It took him over an hour to undergo this repetitive cycle again and again before he finally succeeded in cutting out the elk's femur, a much more complicated process than just cutting off the leg. Silas frowned. "I miscalculated. Judging by the weight of the bone, it exceeded 10 pounds. That was heavier than a longsword and was precisely the kind of burden that Silas couldn't afford to lug around. In a dangerous situation, this would be the first thing he abandoned, and that was not the hallmark of a good weapon. It seemed that this situation was getting to him, after all. He wouldn't normally overlook something like this. Now, he was filthy, covered in blood that was probably its own ticking time bomb, and didn't have anything decent to show for it. No, this is still salvageable. There wasn't much night left, and Silas had to give himself at least 4 hours of sleep. That was his minimum requirement. He had to pivot and find a new path forward. He pulled out the tendons of the leg and placed them high on a nearby tree branch to dry. He just hoped the humidity wouldn't ruin that chance completely. Then, he brought the femur over to a stone. Trying to grind a bone down when it had yet to be purged of its water content was a nightmare. Silas didn't have to be a wilderness junkie to know this. However, the quirk of his blade aura just might become useful here. Silas bet that if he used blade aura on bone, he could speedrun the evaporation of its moisture content and likewise get rid of the marrow within, not much unlike the leaf he had burnt to ash earlier in the day. The bone was thick. If it was dry, he could probably split it in two and sharpen it with greater ease. On top of that, if it lost its moisture content, there was a good chance that it wouldn't be so heavy anymore. Unfortunately, he couldn't use this to speed up the drying process of the tendons. The tendons were just like his hand, being formed entirely of flesh. These deductions flowed through Silas' mind like a river. He felt more at peace and his worries rushed away. Another hour ticked by and Silas breathed out heavy breaths. He had succeeded. From one 10-pound bone that would have been no more than a burden, he now had two split halves that weighed about 3-ish pounds each. Each half was about 3/4 of a meter long and their width had a curve to them. Since bones were obviously hollow, this was an expected result. Thanks to his blade aura, they were perfectly dry as well, allowing him to use the nearby stone to sharpen them both into a point. Although they couldn't exactly be called spears, the longer length should give him some extra leeway. After some thought, Silas stored one in a safe place and rushed out into the forest again, his eyes sharp. There was still time. He gave himself an extra hour and his goal was clear: find another sleeping beast to target. Silas had been thinking about this matter for a long while and he felt that it was impossible that he could just continue to benefit from this loophole. If you could just hide during the day, and target sleeping animals at night, he didn't believe his grandfather would describe this as such a dangerous endeavor. He realized, then, that this night might be a one-off chance. How many would stalk a single elk for an entire day and even wait until it fell asleep like he had? In most cases, humans would be taking this opportunity to sleep themselves, having spent much of the first day acclimating themselves and finding shelter. In addition, moving around in the rainforest at night was almost impossible. The moonlight was sparse and you could hardly see a few meters ahead of you. No one would choose to run around in this environment. But that was exactly why Silas had to. It was precisely in this darkness that it would be possible to spot the descent of ether. He remembered it well. It had a slightly bluish tint, different from the moon's silvery light. It was subtle, but it still stood out somewhat in this dark forest. Right now, he was banking on his luck. No, it wasn't luck. In a forest of this size, the concentration of wildlife should be exceptional. As expected, it didn't take even 10 minutes for Silas to find a cascade of ether. This one, however, made him freeze. Titanoboa, F. Level, 0. Physical, 21. Mental, 0. Wool, 6. Chapter 13, Find Out. A python, one extinct for ages, hung high in the trees. Its 12-meter-long body looped again and again, carrying such mass that it looked to be a miracle that the tree could hold it up at all. Silas had only just thought that he hadn't seen a single carnivore in the region, only to find one mere minutes from his original location. Goosebumps erupted across his skin. Without the slightest hesitation, he decisively left. This was not a creature he wanted to get entangled with. As a researcher, he mostly worked with venomous snakes, and rarely constrictors like this one. However, he had just as much healthy respect for them as the former. This was about the worst kind of extinct creature he could meet, other than maybe dinosaurs themselves. The only good news was that pythons of that size were very slow. But the fact its physical was that high despite what was likely low speed and dexterity meant that its strength and constitution must be off the charts. This was in part due to the ether, Silas was sure. But its evolution wasn't even over yet. Silas made a note to himself that his scouting abilities weren't perfect. He was human and he could only use his eyes. He wasn't the only creature that could blend into the environment, and he was definitely the worst suited to doing so on top of that. Soon, Silas found another cascading waterfall of ether. Red Fox, F. Level, 0. Physical, 17. Mental, 0. Wool, 1. Red foxes should be mostly nocturnal, but it's asleep. This is a plus for my theory about the ether. The high physical stat threw Silas off, but at this point he had pretty much confirmed that this was the benefit of ether. As the night went on, these creatures would only get stronger. By tomorrow, he would be surrounded by superhuman-level beasts and his odds of surviving would only plummet. He moved slowly, making sure to carefully check around the region to ensure that there were no other lurking dangers like the Titanoboa. Then he exploded into action. He raised the femur spear up, activating blade aura and preparing to stab down. But then his heart skipped a beat. Time seemed to slow. The first thing he noticed were the twitching ears of the red fox. As Silas' steely green eyes rushed through the night, they picked up on every detail, each one more of a flashbang to his senses than the last. First it was its ears, then its tail swayed, and by the time Silas loomed over it, it had hopped to its feet, spinning around with a sharp glint in its eyes. Another mistake. Silas was being hard on himself, but that was how he always was. Even so, he didn't slow down or hesitate as he pierced downward. The fox's body blurred, moving so fast that Silas' eyes almost couldn't keep up in the darkness. But he still felt something connect. A yelp came from the fox as a deep gash was torn into its front left shoulder. Silas felt its intention to run away immediately. Remembering its will stat, Silas put two and two together, realizing that this might be a method of telling the tendencies of these creatures as well. This timidity only benefited Silas. The red fox turned in an attempt to run, but its injured front leg threw its balance off and it stumbled. Precisely what Silas was waiting for. He raised up the femur spear again and drove it down, this time right through the spine of the red fox. Another yelp echoed, but it was pinned to the ground and its strength was quickly leaving its body. Silas retreated. With its spine damaged, the fox couldn't run away, but that didn't mean it couldn't try to harm him in some way. It was better safe than sorry. He watched as the red fox breathed its last, his green irises floating in the darkness like eerie orbs of death. Walking forward, he placed a hand on the red fox. Red fox. Gene detected. Fragmented gene, dexterity, F. Attempt assimilation. Yes, no. Silas accepted the assimilation. He wondered if, since this was a dexterity gene, it would also mean that his title would activate. Dexterity had been quite useful to him until now, and it appeared in subtle ways. The more he thought about these stats, the more he felt that they had multiple layers to them. For example, just now, he used all his strength but still managed to drive the femur spear exactly where he wanted it to go. Someone else's accuracy might have been lacking in that rushed moment. As expected, Silas did feel his title take effect, and he got a 10% boost to his success. Gene assimilation starting. Gene assimilation triggered. Silas felt his body seize up for a moment before relaxing. Gene assimilation successful. No wonder there's a choice. If I seize up like that at a bad time, I could die. It's likely that the more intrusive the gene, the worse the experience will be. Silas exhaled a breath. He might have been successful, but he didn't forget about the fox waking up as soon as he approached. He didn't think that was a coincidence. It shouldn't be that the fox had a special ability, though that was a small possibility. Silas was more inclined to believe that it had been startled awake, maybe even by the ether itself. Maybe it wouldn't be as easy as he thought to take advantage of this loophole. There's only one way to find out. Silas went back on the hunt, but this time he was looking for another creature similar to the red fox. Preferably small and weak, with abilities that skewed more towards speed or dexterity. Red fox, F. Level, 0. Physical, 18. Mental, 0. Wool, 2. Silas hid behind a tree and the first thing he did was throw a rock. It soared just over the ears of the red fox. Chapter 14, Gamble. It didn't react. Silas prepared another rock. This time, he threw it similarly, allowing it to soar just over the head of the red fox. However, he took a lot of power off of it. The rock fell just a meter or two away from the red fox, landing in the soft grass. It still didn't react, as though it was too lost in its dreams. Is it really because of me? The noise of that rock wasn't significantly softer than his footsteps had been. After some more thought, Silas picked up a larger rock, about 2 inches in width. He threw it again, but this time at a tree on the opposite side of the clearing the red fox was sleeping in. Tar. Once again, it didn't react. I see. There was no way to tell for certain unless he moved forward himself, but it was as he feared. The animal was shaken awake by his appearance specifically. It must be the case that the Irish elk didn't react to me because it had only just started its evolution. He wasn't sure. He had managed to land a hit on the elk before it woke up, but these foxes. A gamble. Once again, the moment he made the choice, he acted. He burst through the clearing. Adrenaline pumped through his body as he raised the femur short spear. The moment he got within 3 meters, he sensed it all again. The twitch of the ears, the sway of the tail. But this time, it was all just a little bit faster. Even so, while the stats of this red fox were better, Silas was far more prepared. He threw a rock as hard as he could with his off hand. For as long as he could remember, he had been able to use his left and right hands interchangeably, and at this moment, it came in handy. This rock was easily 4 inches in diameter and it had a great heft to it. It slammed down on the head of the red fox just as it tried to get up. The fox's spin was delayed by just a half measure, allowing Silas the time he needed to thrust down with the femur short spear. It was all so perfectly laid out. Unfortunately, Silas was quickly learning that not everything in this world was under his control. The fox's hair suddenly stood on end and its body shivered. In that split moment, it looked almost as though it had caught a bout of cold fever. Scylla's short spear stabbed down and hit nothing but air. The red fox seemed to phase through it, appearing just a meter to the side. For Scylla, who had based his whole life on logical deduction, he felt as though his senses had short-circuited. What just happened? An almost cat-like growl echoed as the fox bared its teeth toward Scylla. With quick movement, Scylla pulled the short spear out of the soft grass. His offhand pulled out the elk antler piece, clutching it tightly as he faced off against the fox. The good news, he had confirmed that this system wouldn't allow him any more easy kills. Last time, he had been within 2 meters before the fox reacted. This time, it was at 3. As these evolutions continued, he bet that the range would only extend and he would only get more and more helpless. The bad news, as though the good news wasn't tinged with enough angst, he now had to actually face off against this animal head-to-head without any tricks to rely on. Oh, and his blade aura's timer was already ticking. Scylla could distinctly hear the rhythm of his breath. The crunching of the grass beneath his bare feet and the slight rustle of the chilly wind felt amplified 100-fold. His usually steady and calm heart sped up, blood rushing through him and flushing his skin red. He was completely on high alert, the tingling sensation of his small hairs rising to attention and goosebumps crawling up his skin feeling as visceral as a sudden dump in a cold lake. Even as he circled the red fox, he realized that it was hesitant to attack as well. Its body continuously shivered, as though it was hesitating between running away and charging forward to rip Scylla's throat out. At that moment, Scylla keenly remembered the cowardice of the first fox he had come across. It hadn't even tried to fight back. This one had a will that was slightly stronger, but it seemed that that cowardice was ingrained into its very bones. The moment Scylla made this deduction, he realized he needed to take the initiative. He spread his arms out wide, revealing the most vital parts of him to attack as he swept toward the red fox. The small creature froze for a moment, distinctly feeling just how much larger Scylla's was than it. The fox wasn't even half a meter from its paws to its shoulders, its overall body length not even reaching an entire meter. Compared to Scylla's, who was well over 6 feet, it was truly small. Scylla's approach could only be said to be crude beyond compare. He distracted the red fox with his arms, flailing him out and flashing his pair of bone weapons. Then, in that final moment of approach, his leg flashed. The red fox's eyes were darting between the bone weapons and didn't even seem to notice as a foot hit it flush in the jaw. Scylla's jaw set into a flexed position. He had a working understanding of the common martial arts, but kicking against something with his bare feet like that wasn't something that he was used to by any stretch of the imagination. The red fox released a yelp. First a stone had hit the back of its skull, and now a strong kick from an existence over 20 times heavier than it had sent it flying. How could it not feel the after-effects? Chapter 15. As Scylla had expected, the physical of the red fox was only so high due to its main stat, dexterity. In addition, it seemed that the odd move it had used before wasn't something it could use continuously. It probably had decent speed as well, but agility would definitely be its strong suit, maybe even acceleration. The more Scylla thought about it, the more he felt that the stat system wasn't nearly comprehensive enough. There should be more to it, but none of those thoughts slowed his movements. He rushed after the red fox as it rolled across the grass, slamming into a nearby tree before it could go too far. It tried to scurry to its feet, but the impact with the tree threw off its timing and, right then, Scylla swept in. He pierced down with his femur short spear. It was then the red fox did something that was out of Scylla's calculations once again. Its tail whipped against the tree, giving it the extra balance it needed to swiftly dodge. Scylla's short spear barely grazed against its ear, drawing blood and nearly cutting it in two. The fox leapt backward and let out an enraged yelp before leaping right at Scylla's head. Its agility was simply beyond common sense. Scylla hadn't even retracted his hand from the first pierce. His body was off balance and the only saving grace was that the fox was facing his body from a narrow angle. Scylla tried to force himself to spin out of the way, but he wasn't nearly as agile as the fox. At the very least, his own dexterity stat seemed far more focused on accuracy and control. The fox bit into his shoulder, angrily tearing into it with its teeth. The jolt of pain shot through Scylla's body and his mind went blank. In his life, he had never broken a bone, he never suffered any severe wounds, he had never even had any close run-ins with death, even given all the rare snakes he worked with. This could be said to be the worst sort of pain he had experienced in his life, and it came from a small creature with a maw so small it couldn't even properly get a hold of even his relatively lean shoulder. Even the bite marks were hardly a couple of centimeters deep. An odd feeling welled up in his heart as time seemed to slow around him. It was one part humiliation, another part a reality check, and a final part excitement. His opposite hand suddenly flashed over with the antler blade. His blade aura was just about to tick down to 0, but there was still just enough left to drive it right through the eye socket of the fox. The red fox released in panic, but it couldn't dodge as it fell to the ground. Silas raised his injured arm and drove the short spear right through the throat of the red fox. His blade aura blinked out, and a wave of fatigue hit him. He took deep breaths, standing there with his shoulder pooling with blood. His heartbeat was no longer calm, beating like a drum in his chest. Every pump seemed to force more blood out of his shoulder and reverberate through his very bones. It took a long while before he calmed down. Just what was that rush? Red fox. Gene detected. Fragmented gene, dexterity, F. Attempt assimilation. Yes, no. Silas didn't forget himself entirely. He couldn't stay here for long. He had some worries about whether that fox had rabies. If it did, he would be in trouble. But he felt that he should be safe unless this system spawned viruses as well. For all of these extinct creatures to suddenly return, they had to have been recreated by some unknown method, maybe a far more advanced kind of cloning than the people of Earth had access to. In that case, unless they were also being needlessly cruel, there shouldn't be a reason to release viruses along with that. That wouldn't preclude new viruses from manifesting on their own, but he could at least hope that he wouldn't be that unlucky. Gene assimilation starting. Gene assimilation triggered. Silas felt his title activate once again. Gene assimilation successful. Gene talent detected. Trade 10 fragmented dexterity, F, to unlock, sudden burst. Yes, no. Silas' brows raised. He hadn't expected to run into such a thing so quickly. But he could only choose, no. He didn't have 10 gene fragments in total, let alone 10 of this particular kind. It would also be a hard pill to swallow, even if he had the opportunity. After all, losing 10 gene fragments would also mean losing all the stat boosts that came with it. Name: Silas Grimblade. Species: Human, F. Affiliation: Grimblade lineage. Level: 0. Titles: A Patient Stalker. Physical: 8. Greater than Strength: 5. Greater than Constitution: 5. Greater than Dexterity: 13. Greater than Speed: 8. Mental: 6. Greater than Intelligence: 5. Greater than Wisdom: 10. Greater than Charisma: 2. Wool: 11. Luck: 1. Gene state: Soft. Fragmented genes: Grimblade lineage, F2, Dexterity, F. Gene talents: Blade aura, mutated weakened, sudden burst, dormant, F. Each fragmented dexterity gene had given him a +1 to his dexterity stat. If he wanted to awaken sudden burst, he would need to give all of that up. He had been lucky, getting 2 successes in a row, but the failure of the elk was still looming over his head. There probably wouldn't be such a good chance to kill an elk that easily again, either. Unlike the red foxes, the elks outmassed him. If he got caught by an elk like he had the red fox just now, instead of a few shallow wounds, it would have been broken bones at best. In this environment, he couldn't afford such devastating injuries. The good news was that, according to his grandfather, just the existence of ether within him allowed wounds to heal much more quickly. An injury that would usually take weeks to heal might only take a few days now. Even so, those few days were too valuable to him right now. His soft gene state would end soon. Chapter 16, Choice. I need to target small animals, ones that are at best 10% of my body weight, at worst 50%. Until I have the strength to go up against much more dangerous creatures, I will have to stick with what I can comfortably deal with even if I have no ether or extra genes. Silas laid down his pride and realized he couldn't be some big game hunter if he wanted to survive. If he could just eat bugs on his way to gaining genes, he would do so. but he had killed a few while stalking the elk just for a meal, and there was never anything to gain. He assumed that the system had some sort of minimum size requirement, or he was targeting the wrong kind of bugs. There was some good news aside from the blow to his ego. For one, the corpses of the 2 red foxes he had killed were much more manageable than the elk. If he used his blade aura to target a small part of it, he could even cook them without starting a fire. Grandfather said I should look for a dungeon soon as well. Reach 20 physical as quickly as possible and enter a dungeon. There were only 2 ways to gain items and treasures aside from genes in this gamified world. The first was to steal from spawned cities, and the second was dungeons. These spawned cities were different from the system cities that would appear after the trial period was over. They were challenges created for those that chose the common city stele. Though there was no rule that said that Silas couldn't attack one even without a city stele, it's just that he would have a death wish if he tried to do so. The second and more manageable challenge were the dungeons. That wasn't to say that they were easy, but rather that the variables were tightly controlled. Unfortunately, entering a dungeon was easier said than done. According to his grandfather, dungeons gave off a dense concentration of ether. Due to that, more powerful creatures tended to flock around it even though they could not enter. 20 physical was more of a requirement just to lay eyes on it than it was a minimum to enter. Silas took a breath. Sleep. He broke out into a light jog, taking a more roundabout route back to the elk's territory. He found a natural gourd hanging from a tree and ripped it off. Then, he entered the region of a familiar lake. Gourds needed to be carefully dried and prepped for a long while before they could be used like containers, but Silas had a convenient shortcut for that. At this point, blade aura felt far more useful for miscellaneous matters than it was for actual combat. This would be the only convenient time he would be able to come to this lake, so he had to take advantage. Silas froze. He looked down at the clear waters and couldn't believe what he was seeing. Aside from the dirty reflection that looked back at him, beyond that, deep within, there seemed to be something radiating a dense pulse of ether. It was a dungeon, Silas was certain. But what he couldn't understand was how he could possibly be so unlucky. If the dungeon was in the water, wouldn't that mean that all the most powerful beasts would flock here after their evolutions were complete? Even if he followed down the river, because of what he had learned from his grandfather, he knew it would be useless. With this level of ether being pumped out, it would definitely follow the current and raise the concentration for countless kilometers. The longer this dungeon went unfinished, the worse the situation would get. How would he get water? Fruits, rain, blood. These were the only answers Silas could come up with, but each was unreliable. Fruits or vegetables could tide his hydration over for a while, but how long? An extra few days. Given how much exercise he was doing on a daily basis, his throat was already dry after just today alone and he was running on empty. If not for his great stamina, he might have already collapsed. Rain. This was a rainforest, after all. In a particularly tropical rainforest, it might even occur every few hours. However, in this last day, no rain had fallen. In addition, he had no idea how the introduction of ether would impact the ecosystem and weather. Even if it had rained, it would be hard to rely on it. If he took a step back and chose to blindly believe that it would rain, how would he capture it? His mobility was his greatest asset right now, but having a reliable form of collecting rain required a base, a protected one. And what if one day his base was compromised, and all his accumulated rain was ruined? Relying on blood was the worst of the options. He still hadn't dismissed the possibility that the red fox gave him rabies. How could he, in good conscience, drink blood? Even if he was willing to take that chance, blood had a sodium content about as high as salt water. He would just be killing himself slowly. Silas dunked his head into the water. Having already been chilled by the night, it was a nice shock to his system. He greedily took large gulps, and for the first time, he wasn't hyperfixated on the surrounding environment, always looking around another corner for the next creature that wanted to eat his flesh. It was easily a minute before he pulled himself out. This was what he had wanted. No. Excitement. Was this exciting? No. It was terrifying. There was a slight tremor in his body that hadn't been there before. The idea of slowly dying of dehydration played in his mind so vividly that he might as well have already experienced it once before. That was the ultimate outcome. No matter how many ideas he thought of, that was the end of it. He couldn't escape it. If he left here today, it would be a race between his body tapping out and his physical reaching 20, but even if the latter managed to win out, what state would his body be in at that point? Could he even fight his way back here? He had followed that elk for so long, moving across dozens of kilometers, and yet didn't see a single ounce of water elsewhere. He didn't like that feeling of helplessness. It was why he had made the stupid decision of coming here in the first place. Silas stood at his feet. He pulled his blood-matted shirt and pants off before he began to clean his body. All the dirt, mud, and grime from the day were peeled off layer by layer under the harsh rubbing of his fingers. His green eyes didn't contain any fear, nor helplessness. It was hard to read his emotions at all as he finally stepped out, feeling the cool wind slowly dry him. He stood there in silence, ironically as one with nature as he had ever been. Somewhere deep inside, he seemed to understand that this might truly be his last day. His gaze landed on a tree with particularly large leaves and he pulled down a few vines from the surroundings. Carefully, he bundled his clothing into these leaves and tied them up tight using the vines. Then, he dove into the waters, holding his short spear and antler blade in one hand, while dragging his bundle of clothes in the other. He would rather die in that dungeon than slowly cannibalize his own body out here. That was the choice of Silas Brown. Chapter 17, Slithering Madness. Silas' feet kicked at the water. In the depths of the darkness, the only thing that provided a light was the dungeon pumping with ether in the distance. It must have been at least 20 meters beneath the surface, but had it been the light of day, Silas wouldn't have noticed it at all. Though Silas thought about the possibility that this dungeon would take place entirely in the water, according to his grandfather, there would be a small introduction to the dungeon before you entered. It could only be said that if the dungeon was truly underwater, he would be doubly screwed. At that point, he could only try to store as much water as he could in the gourds and hope it rained more often. It didn't take him more than a few seconds to reach the cave opening. Dexterity seems to be more important in the water than speed. Silas gave some breath to a fleeting thought before a flash appeared in his mind. Slithering Madness F. Level Maximum, 0. Recommended, 50 Physical. Description: lurking in the depths, high in the trees and on the forest floors, they are natural predators, unfettered and unbothered. So scorned by the skies, they've been restricted to a life of crawling on their bellies. But the day to rise again is not far off. Silas would have sucked in a cold breath if he wasn't submerged in water right now. According to his grandfather, 20 Physical was recommended, but Silas knew his grandfather well. Ever since Silas was young, his grandfather had been trying to manipulate him using information, not out of maliciousness, but rather kind intentions. Silas seemed to very easily see both sides of a situation and could rationally pick a middle ground that fit well with what was in line with reality. This was a trait not taught to him by his parents, but rather his grandfather. Ever since he was about 16, he could see through his grandfather's intentions and somewhat knew that Magnus was trying to pull him toward a certain direction. But despite his demeanor, Silas loved his family and felt no need to expose his grandfather for something so trivial. Magnus had learned very early on that Silas couldn't be pushed and pulled with appeals to emotion and fallacies. The facts were what one had to manipulate or obstruct to get at him. This was all to say that when his grandfather said he would need 20 Physical, it was almost certainly less than that. Silas had guessed that most dungeons probably had a recommended entry of around 15 Physical, maybe even less. But, 50, why would this dungeon's recommended stats be so high? That was more than double that of the most dangerous creature he had seen until now, the Titanoboa. That aside, what about the explanation? How could it be considered a description at all? It only barely confirmed to him by the comments about trees and the ground that it at least wouldn't be underwater. And yet there was no other choice. Will you enter? Yes, no. The words practically taunted him. But he never hesitated when he made decisions. The world blurred around him. Ellipsis. Silas' eyes focused, and what appeared before him was an odd world. The first thing he felt was the cobbled stone beneath his feet. As he continued to look around, he pulled out his bundle of clothing and slipped on the madammed blood-caked cheap pair of pants and shirt the system had given him. The world was dark in an odd sense, because the skies were pitch black, without stars or a moon in sight, and yet he could see just fine, almost as though the ground and the objects on it gave off their own weird light. It was hard to see anything that deviated away from the cobblestone path, though. So, his eyes could only focus on the forked road ahead. Down one path, the cobbled road curved and seemed to lead toward more stone. Down the other, foliage began to appear, grass grew from the cracks of the stone and the faint outline of trees could be seen in the distance. A choice. Silas didn't rush. He had expected to be thrown into danger immediately, or even die a sudden death before he could get a lay of the land, but this was unexpectedly peaceful. If he didn't take the opportunity to take a breath now, he might never get another chance. The description should clearly be about snakes, but in that case, why would there be a path that seemed to lead toward a civilization of some sort? Unless the snakes the description referred to are one of those alien races grandfather mentioned. In the end, Silas walked toward the path of dense foliage. Ultimately, only one thing mattered to him, and that was maximizing his chances at survival. Civilization sounded nice and cozy, but it would also plummet his odds of living to zero. There would be no terrain to take advantage of, no place to hide, and everything would be up to his raw ability. On the side of the wilderness, he at least had a small chance. The only silver lining in all of this was the fact that the animal he was the most confident in dealing with was the snake. Not that it would matter if they all had 50 physical. However, Silas had his own opinions on that. The recommended physical should be proportional to the best challenge this dungeon had to offer. In that case, it should mean that the boss of this dungeon would take 50 physical for one to have a shot at defeating it, but that didn't necessarily mean all the challenges would be at that level. If he could pick and choose his targets like he had with the red fox, he had a chance. The last red fox he had dealt with already had 18 physical. There was a ray of hope, even though it was small. The cobbled stone path slowly disappeared and Silas watched as the skies above his head began to gain color as the previous path vanished. Did I make the right choice? Chapter 18. Silas never hesitated when he made a decision, but that didn't mean he wouldn't reflect. The fact he felt like he had entered a new world now meant that he had given something up, but he wasn't even sure what the other choice was about. That feeling of not knowing grated on him, but he didn't have the time to linger on it. His steps slowed, and he began to scan each and every leaf he came across as though it might be the next one to suddenly pop out with a vicious snake. Dungeons came in all shapes and sizes. His grandfather had said they likely hadn't documented them all, and unfortunately, this seemed to be among the undocumented ones. As Silas continued to walk, his sense of focus riding an edge of adrenaline, his anticipation only grew with every second an enemy didn't appear. While the cobbled stone path had vanished, the forest itself had still carved out a small, unkept path. It was hard to spot amidst all the foliage, and Silas guessed that if he had been in the forest itself, he could have easily missed it. But because he had started off on the path, it was easy to continue following it. Should I? After moving about 50 meters or so, Silas made the decision to deviate from the path. Not far, but rather 3 to 5 meters, offset to the right. He wanted to see where the path was leading to, but he didn't want to dive headfirst into what was coming either. Every decision he made felt like he had done so blindly. There just didn't seem to be anything better to do. He might very well be trading in one danger for another. The path might be leading him to danger, but who knew if there were venomous snakes ready to bite at his ankles in all this high grass. If he had the skill to, he would have used the trees as a path instead, but other than some light experience with recreational rock climbing, he wasn't exactly a spry monkey. He continued to follow the path, and eventually he reached it. There's just no way. Little Madness F. Level, 0. Physical, 31. Mental, 3. Will, 6. Up ahead, there was a small clearing, the only obvious path leading to it that didn't require leaping over shrubbery or trees, being the very path Silas was offset from. In that clearing, a python with scales of orange and black lay in the grass. Though it was curled up, it must have been at least 5 meters long, while its jaw was lined with countless little spikes. 31 physical is one thing, but 3 mental. Assuming its wisdom was 0 and its charisma was likewise low, that would mean that its intelligence is double mine. Wisdom was a measure of one's reasoning ability, knowledge, and other matters related of the sort. These creatures were likely not intelligent in that way just yet. However, intelligence was a measure of ether control and abundance. If Silas' assumption was correct, he was outclassed by an impossibly large margin. It was possible that the recommendation of 50 physical was just to offset the disparity in ether control. These creatures were naturally granted such abilities in their sleep, but Silas and others like him could only slowly unlock them over time through genes and other methods. Was he just supposed to rush in and throw his life away? Silas frowned. There had to be another method. He turned back and began to slowly comb through the forest, keeping track of where he was, where he had been, and where he was going. He must have spent half an hour going around, and yet he found nothing. One would have thought that some other creature would have at least jumped out at him, but it seemed that there were no others present. Is this a flawed dungeon? A dungeon separated into several floors usually had this sort of setup. The next floor wouldn't appear until the boss of this one was defeated. But according to his grandfather, such dungeons usually had smaller opponents lingering around. This slithering madness dungeon, though, had none of that. Silas wasn't sure whether to be relieved or devastated. Without smaller enemies to face, he had no way of increasing his strength. Silas winced as his toes hit against something. Luckily, he had been walking quite slowly and observing every little thing around him, or he would have face-planted right into the barrier. He had walked so far that he returned to his original starting area, the very area where the cobblestone path had originally been, and disappeared. About what I expected. If the choice was an important aspect of the dungeon, it wouldn't just let him reverse it without reason. What's that? Silas touched the barrier again, this time more than ready to process the ripples. All across it, appearing and disappearing in a flash, snakes of all shapes and sizes performed all kinds of movements. Some seemed to be in battle, some seemed to be intertwined in an odd mating ritual, and some simply rose high, baring their fangs and roaring at Silas. It only appeared for a moment, but Silas felt his heart skip a beat. He kept touching the barrier again and again, just to see those ripples once more. His eyes went red, but he didn't have a reflection of himself to see it. It was instead the rushing of his blood and the pain in his eyes that made him pull back, his features pulling into a tight frown. Your will has been influenced. -1 will temporary. Silas was surprised by the sudden notification. Just looking at the barrier had done that to him. And what did temporary mean? Would it be a few seconds? Hours? Days? Will was his strongest stat aside from dexterity, but he couldn't say that he cared very much that he lost a point. When he had gained one, he didn't feel much different to begin with. And like he had said previously, he felt the fact there was a will stat was peculiar. How could you even measure that? Chapter 19, Will. Although Silas was a bit stubborn about it, he wasn't a fool, either. He chose to pull back from the barrier for now and take note of how long it would take to recover. Since the system listed will, and just now he had entered a bit of a trance, it was obviously more important than he had given it credit for. He was in a new world now and he had to do away with his old way of thinking about some things. Silas continued to walk around, getting a lay of the land. Why add all this extra space if the boss fight is the only thing of importance here? He came across a small lake. It didn't seem to have anything feeding into it, but it did give him a sense of calm. Taking a seat by its shores, he just sat there and stared out into it. There's nothing stopping me from staying here forever unless there's some hidden timer I'm not aware of. I'm not sure if it's possible to alert that python, but at this point, it would be better to fight it in all this than in that opening. At least I'd have a chance to run out here. Thinking to this point, Silas began to build a fire. Once it was complete, he took out one of the 2 red fox carcasses, using the antler blade and the small lake to clean it up. He didn't have any seasonings to pair it with, but it was still the best meal he had ever had. He ate the entire fox, leaving nothing wasted but its inner organs and bones. It's gone now. Will, 11. His will had gone back to 11, but it didn't take the entirety of the hour or so he had just wasted. It took just under 20 minutes or so. It was just a rough guess he had. It wasn't as though he had a clock, he just felt he was quite good at roughly estimating that sort of thing. Though who knew, his sense of time might have already been distorted. I feel energetic. Silas hadn't slept in over a day now, so he had already begun to feel some lingering fatigue. But after eating the red fox, it felt like he had just gotten a full night's rest. He had wanted to take the opportunity to get some sleep in as well, but it seemed that was no longer necessary. Silas took note of where the lake was after taking another long drink, then began to walk around once again. He didn't even know what he was looking for. Maybe it wasn't a thing he wanted, but a flash of inspiration instead. Your will has been influenced. -1 will temporary. He ended up running into another barrier, part of the same larger whole but located in a different region. He had just told himself to not be so stubborn, but something about the fact something could impact his own willpower was annoying him. Or maybe it was just that this situation was really starting to get to him. It's just taking away and giving me back the same point it gave me in the first place. The only reason his will was 11 was because of his A Patient Stalker title. He found it somewhat amusing that it was this point that was being taken and given once more again and again. It felt like a farce. It even made him a bit angry. He was Silas Brown. He walked to the rhythm of his own beat. Silas shook his head. This wasn't like him. He frowned. Your will has been tainted. -2 will temporary. The moment the debuff hit him, Silas felt a wave of nausea. It came so suddenly and unexpectedly that he heaved. A burning in his throat overwhelmed his senses, and he felt that he was just moments away from throwing up the meal he just had. No, I can't. This thought consumed him. He only had one fox carcass remaining. The only other food in the vicinity seemed to be the boss python. If he threw up here, the loss would be tremendous. Pull yourself together. Silas couldn't remember being so agitated in a long time. Ever since he had left his formative years, he was used to being calm and in control. Maybe his greatest fear was losing that control. He maintained strict discipline. He didn't drink, he didn't do drugs, he didn't even eat sugar because he didn't like the influence it had on him. But now some mysterious force was pulling at him from all sides, playing with his mind, and he absolutely hated it. Enough. Silas' red eyes returned, but this time it wasn't due to him staring at the barrier. It was rather something inside of them that spun wildly out of control. This something wasn't natural. It was a product of the debuff that was pressing down on him. It retaliated against Silas' will, pressing it down even further. Your will has been tainted. -1 will temporary. Your will has been tainted. -1 will temporary. The first time it appeared, it had said influenced. The debuff of -2 will, though, had come with a tainted tag. Every time Silas tried to fight back against it, it would lash out again, ripping out another piece of his will. Silas knew that, logically, he should stop. He should stop moving, remove as much sensory information as he could, and hunker down. This was the smart thing to do, the logical thing to do. The moment his will fell beneath 10, the barrier seemed to have placed a suppressive effect on him, an effect he hadn't noticed earlier because his will was too high. Silas hadn't even realized that the moment he chose a path, the challenge had begun. The reason there was no timer was because no one could stay here indefinitely, not without losing their mind and going to challenge the python in a fit of rage. But Silas had accidentally stumbled onto this hidden challenge all on his own. Silas' will was blinking and flashing, and suddenly it hit a critical low. Will 1. Expression turned savage and wild. He bared his teeth as though he were a wild beast, veins pumping across his body as though individual pythons were squirming beneath his skin. Chapter 20, Lose. He looked in the direction of the boss monster. It was as though he could sense it all so clearly, but when he exploded forward, his body was jerked backward. A light of madness glowed in his eyes as he looked at his arm. His fingers dug into the bark of a tree just adjacent to him. He held onto it with everything he had, blood pooling from his nails and particularly nasty streaks of veins pumping along his forearm. His body wanted to go in one direction, but this arm alone seemed to have a mind of its own. He pulled hard and a few of his nails chipped as he ripped himself free. He rushed forward with his greatest speed, only for his arm to latch onto another tree. This time, he fell back hard, a stinging pain coming from his shoulder. From an outside observer, it looked as though he had just tried to tackle a tree. The fact he got away with only a stinging pain was a miracle to begin with. I said enough. The roar came out of just one side of Silas' mouth, one half of his lips quirking in an attempt to speak, and the other wanting to continue growling and baring his fangs. He felt as though he was trapped inside of his own mind, just the smallest hint of sanity keeping him together. If he allowed himself to run to that python, the only path for him remaining would be death. This wasn't the ending he wanted. He was in control of nothing if not his own mind, his own thoughts. There was true fury stirring within him, but it was only making the situation worse. The debuff, the curse, or whatever this influence was, latched onto it and stirred it up, pulling out parts hidden so deep that even Silas didn't know they existed. And yet, he was forced to face them. Why had he come here? Why did he put his life at risk? Why did he look his loving mother and father in the eye, his adorable little sister, and lie to them? It wasn't just for some excitement, that was too small a part of it. It wasn't because he was dissatisfied with his life, that was too small a part of it. It wasn't even because he cherished his own last name so much and refused to be a Grimblade, and that was despite the fact he still called himself Silas Brown to this day, regardless of what this damned system said. It was because he couldn't stand the idea of being under someone else's heel. It was because he didn't want to be just a cog in the wheel. He wanted to be the wheel itself, the carriage that rolled on it, the treasure that was being escorted from place to place in luxury. He had childishly come to throw his life away in a world he knew next to nothing about, all because he couldn't keep his ego in check. That was the part he had been ignoring. That was the part of him that he had buried deep, the part he had ignored because he considered himself a logical man above such boorish and man-child-like ideals. But he wasn't. He was still a hot-blooded young man in his 20s. He wasn't free of those dreams all young men had. To be a hero, a knight in shining armor, Rambo in a forest with a machine gun tucked under one arm and a machete in the other. Title unlocked. A flexible will. Your will is truly one of a kind, but it is immature and still changing. Continue to forge it, young man. +10 will. +10% will. Silas hardly registered the notification. The red slowly receded from his eyes and he coughed heavily, waves of pain hitting his body, especially from his right hand. Looking at it shakily, he had completely lost one nail, and two others were split right in the middle. It might have been even better if he lost them completely. At the very least, this seemed to be his worst injury. The rest was just aches and bruises. You have survived the madness. Your comprehension of the madness has deepened, +1 will. Finally, Silas got a grasp of what was going on. He slowly rose to his feet, his eyes widening when he saw that he was actually standing at the very edge of a familiar clearing. Just another half-meter and he would have been in the boss territory. The thought was frightening, but for some reason, he calmed down much quicker than he felt he should have. He looked at his stat menu. Name, Silas Grimblade, species, human, F. Affiliation, Grimblade lineage, level, 0. Titles, a flexible will, a patient stalker, physical, 8. Greater than, strength, 5. Greater than, constitution, 5. Greater than, dexterity, 13. Greater than, speed, 8. Mental, 6. Greater than, intelligence, 5. Greater than, wisdom, 10. Greater than, charisma, 2. Will, 24. Luck, 1. Skill. Comprehensions, madness, gene state, soft. Fragmented genes, Grimblade lineage, F2, dexterity, F. Gene talents, blade aura, mutated weakened, sudden burst, dormant, F. That's a slightly different color. It was very subtle, and only by a shade or two, but Silas felt that a flexible will had a deeper color than a patient stalker. His grandfather had said that titles with percentage boosts were rarer, so maybe that was part of it. But he once again found it peculiar that he didn't have grades associated with titles. Was the slight color change supposed to be the replacement? He wasn't sure. Silas' attention was drawn to the comprehension portion. He hadn't seen anything but a dashed line there before, but now there was madness. In addition, it had a familiar line through the grade tag, much like his blade aura gene talent did. Silas took that to mean that his comprehension was too lacking for it to be properly ranked. What was more surprising than that was that he had actually come across a comprehension at all. According to his grandfather, comprehensions were about the only thing that could compete with gene talents in terms of usefulness. Skills could fall into that category as well, but there were a wide range of skills, many of which could be entirely useless. Gene talents and comprehensions, however, almost never were. This was his grandfather's understanding, anyway. Silas frowned. Madness. Do I need to lose my mind to use it?